Number 1. Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. Dennis Rader appeared to be the embodiment of suburban normalcy in Wichita, Kansas, where he lived an unremarkable life that perfectly concealed one of the most calculated and terrifying serial killers in American history. For over 3 decades, Rader successfully maintained a dual existence that seemed impossible in its stark contradiction. By day, he was a devoted member of Christ Lutheran Church where he served as president of the Congregation Council, a married father of 2 children, a Cub Scout leader who mentored young boys in his community, and a compliance officer for Park City who took his job enforcing municipal codes with almost obsessive seriousness. He was known for being overly strict about regulations, measuring grass height and citing minor violations with an enthusiasm that annoyed his neighbors but seemed merely quirky rather than sinister. His wife Paula and their children knew him as a dependable if somewhat controlling husband and father who maintained their home meticulously and insisted on order in all aspects of family life. Yet this same man who lectured neighbors about trash can placement and led children in camping activities was simultaneously the BTK Killer, an acronym he gave himself that stood for bind, torture, kill, a serial murderer who had terrorized Wichita since 1974. Between January 1974 and January 1991, Rader murdered 10 people with a methodical cruelty that demonstrated both careful planning and a complete absence of empathy. His first attack came on January 15, 1974, when he cut the phone lines to the Otero family home and entered to find Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and 3 of their 5 children. Rader systematically strangled Joseph and Julie, then took their 11-year-old daughter Josephine to the basement where he hanged her after sexually assaulting her, and also killed their 9-year-old son Joseph Jr. The 2 other children who were home were spared only because they hid and Rader didn't find them. This brutal quadruple homicide shocked Wichita, but it was only the beginning. Over the following years, Rader would strike again and again, choosing victims seemingly at random, though he later revealed he had stalked many potential targets before selecting those he murdered. He killed Catherine Bright in April 1974, Shirley Vian in March 1977, Nancy Fox in December 1977, Maureen Hedge in April 1985, Vicki Wegerle in September 1986, and Dolores Davis in January 1991. Each murder followed his disturbing pattern of binding, torturing, and killing, with Rader later describing his victims as projects, and the murders as fulfilling sexual fantasies he had harbored since childhood. What made Rader particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize his crimes completely from his public persona. He would murder someone, then return home to have dinner with his family, attend church services, or go to work enforcing city codes without any apparent psychological difficulty maintaining these contradictory identities. After his final known murder in 1991, BTK went silent for over a decade, and investigators assumed he had either died, been incarcerated for other crimes, or simply stopped killing. The community began to heal, though the unsolved cases haunted local law enforcement and the families of victims who had never received justice or answers. Then, in March 2004, the Wichita Eagle newspaper received a letter from someone claiming to be BTK, reigniting the investigation and the community's fear. Rader had been triggered by a series of articles about the BTK case and couldn't resist the urge to communicate again, to remind everyone that he was still out there and still wanted recognition for his crimes. Over the following months, he sent multiple communications to media outlets and police, including packages containing personal items taken from victims and photographs he had taken of himself in bondage positions wearing his victims' clothing. This compulsion to communicate and receive attention would ultimately lead to his downfall. In his arrogance and desire for recognition, Rader asked police in a letter whether a floppy disk could be traced if he sent information on one. Detective Ken Landwehr, leading the BTK task force, saw an opportunity and responded through a newspaper ad that a floppy disk would be safe and couldn't be traced, a calculated lie that Rader believed. In February 2005, Rader sent a floppy disk to a local television station, and computer forensic analysis quickly revealed metadata showing the disk had been used by someone named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. Investigators cross-referenced this information and identified Dennis Rader, then obtained a DNA sample from his daughter's medical records at a university clinic that matched DNA recovered from BTK crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, police arrested Rader as he was driving near his home, and the community was stunned to learn that BTK, the phantom killer who had terrorized their city for decades, was this ordinary-seeming city compliance officer and church leader. During interrogation, Rader spoke about his crimes with disturbing casualness and pride, referring to his victims by number and discussing his murder techniques as if describing a hobby. He showed investigators where he had hidden a cache of items in a remote area, including jewelry taken from victims, drawings he had made depicting his crimes and fantasies, and detailed records he had kept documenting his murders. Rader pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder in June 2005, and during his sentencing hearing, he provided detailed descriptions of each murder that horrified the courtroom and gave families some answers while also traumatizing them with the cold, methodical way he recounted killing their loved ones. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole for 175 years, and Kansas had no death penalty at the time of his sentencing. The BTK case revealed how a serial killer could hide in plain sight for over 30 years, maintain a family life and professional career, actively participate in community institutions including church leadership, and still commit acts of extraordinary cruelty without anyone suspecting his dark double life. Rader's wife Paula filed for an emergency divorce shortly after his arrest, stating she had known nothing of his crimes and had been completely deceived throughout their 34-year marriage. His children have also maintained they had no knowledge of their father's secret life and have struggled with the revelation that the man who raised them was responsible for such horrific acts. The case prompted extensive psychological analysis of how someone could maintain such radically different identities, with experts noting that Rader appeared to genuinely believe his public persona while also fully embracing his identity as BTK, keeping the two completely separate in his mind. Today, Dennis Rader remains incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he continues to seek attention through attempting to communicate with media and researchers, though prison officials restrict his ability to profit from or glorify his crimes. The BTK case stands as a chilling reminder that evil does not always announce itself, and that those who commit the most terrible acts can be remarkably skilled at presenting a facade of normalcy that deceives even those closest to them. Number 2. John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy presented himself to his Chicago suburban community as a successful businessman, devoted Democratic Party volunteer, and beloved children's entertainer who brought joy to hospitals and charitable events dressed as Pogo the Clown, a persona that would later become one of the most chilling ironies in criminal history. Throughout the 1970s, Gacy was regarded as a pillar of his Norwood Park Township community, known for hosting elaborate annual summer parties that drew hundreds of neighbors, local politicians, and even law enforcement officers who had no idea they were socializing at the home of an active serial killer. Gacy had worked hard to build this respectable image after relocating to Chicago following a 1968 conviction for sexually assaulting a teenage employee at a Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise he managed in Waterloo, Iowa, a crime for which he served 18 months before being paroled. After his release and the dissolution of his first marriage, Gacy moved back to Chicago, started a construction business called PDM Contractors that became quite successful, remarried, and purchased the modest ranch house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in unincorporated Norwood Park Township that would become a house of horrors. Gacy threw himself into community involvement with an energy that seemed to prove he had rehabilitated himself and left his criminal past behind. He joined the JC's civic organization, organized Polish Constitution Day parades, became a Democratic Party precinct captain, and even had his photograph taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter at a Democratic event, an image that would later shock the nation when his crimes were revealed. His clown performances at children's hospitals and charity events earned him local recognition and goodwill, and he seemed to genuinely enjoy entertaining children, though he later told investigators that he never had sexual interest in children and specifically targeted teenage boys and young men. Behind this carefully constructed facade of civic responsibility and good citizenship, Gacy was luring young men and teenage boys to his home where he would sexually assault, torture, and murder them before burying most of their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. His pattern typically involved offering construction work to vulnerable young men, many of whom were runaways or drifters, then convincing them to come to his home where he would offer them alcohol, sometimes show them magic tricks involving handcuffs, and then overpower and restrain them. Once they were helpless, Gacy would subject his victims to hours of torture and sexual assault before ultimately strangling them, often using a rope tourniquet he called his trick, that allowed him to slowly strangle victims while lecturing them about their supposed moral failings. Gacy later explained that he would sometimes read biblical passages to his victims as they died, demonstrating the profound psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to reconcile his brutal acts with his public persona as a community leader and children's entertainer. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history at the time of his capture. He buried 26 victims in the crawl space under his house, 3 more on his property, and disposed of 4 others in the Des Plaines River when he ran out of burial space. The stench from the decomposing bodies became so noticeable that Gacy told friends, family, and his second wife Carol that there was a moisture problem causing mold in the crawl space, and he spread lime there claiming it would help with the smell. His wife, who divorced him in 1976, later said she had noticed the terrible odor but believed his explanation about plumbing and moisture problems. Throughout these years, Gacy continued his construction business, his political activities, his clown performances, and his social life without arousing serious suspicion despite the fact that numerous young men associated with him disappeared without explanation. The investigation that finally exposed Gacy's crimes began in December 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Pius disappeared after telling his mother he was going to see a contractor about a summer job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy, who had been at the pharmacy where Pius worked to discuss a remodeling bid. Detective Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak of the Des Plaines Police Department began investigating Gacy and quickly discovered his prior conviction in Iowa, which prompted more intensive surveillance. As police monitored Gacy, his behavior became increasingly erratic, and he was aware of the surveillance, at one point inviting the watching officers into his home for drinks and even bringing them food while they sat in their cars. On December 13, 1978, investigators obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home, and while the initial search didn't immediately reveal bodies, they found suspicious items including handcuffs, a receipt from a pharmacy for photo processing, police badges, a syringe, and clothing too small for Gacy. The receipt led police to discover that Gacy had taken photographs of what appeared to be a body in his crawl space, and the terrible odor throughout the house prompted investigators to obtain a second, more thorough search warrant. On December 21, 1978, investigators began excavating the crawl space and almost immediately discovered human remains. Gacy was arrested and confessed to killing approximately 30 people, leading investigators to the various burial locations on his property and in the river. The excavation of Gacy's property became a massive forensic operation that drew international media attention as body after body was recovered from beneath the house where Gacy had hosted parties, run his business, and lived with his family. 28 bodies were eventually recovered from the property, and dental records and other evidence helped identify most of the victims, though several remain unidentified to this day despite ongoing efforts using modern DNA technology. Gacy's trial in 1980 became a media spectacle, with the prosecution presenting overwhelming physical evidence and Gacy's own confessions, while the defense argued he was insane and should not be held criminally responsible. Gacy himself testified, attempting to blame the murders on employees of his construction company and presenting a confused narrative that the jury rejected. Forensic psychiatrists testified about Gacy's personality disorders and his ability to compartmentalize his violent impulses from his public life, explaining how he could function so normally in society while committing such horrific crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Gacy guilty on all 33 murder counts, and he was sentenced to death. During his 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center, Gacy continued to seek attention and maintain his public persona to some degree, granting interviews in which he alternately confessed to and denied his crimes, claiming to have been framed or suggesting he had dissociative identity disorder. He took up painting and produced hundreds of artworks, many depicting himself as Pogo the Clown, that became controversial when collectors bought them and in some cases publicly destroyed them. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois, and his final words reportedly were dismissive and showed no remorse for his victims. The Gacy case profoundly impacted how law enforcement investigates missing persons cases involving vulnerable populations like runaways and young men who might not be immediately reported missing by family. It also highlighted how serial killers can hide behind respectable social facades, using community involvement and professional success as camouflage that deflects suspicion even when people around them disappear. The house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was demolished shortly after the investigation concluded, and the property was vacant for years before being subdivided, with many people refusing to build or live there due to its horrific history. The Gacy case remains one of the most studied in criminal psychology because it demonstrates so clearly how a person can maintain radically different identities, how someone can commit acts of extreme violence while simultaneously functioning normally in society, and how charisma and community involvement can serve as effective masks for the darkest impulses. Number 3. BTK Killer's neighbor Harold Shipman, Dr. Death. Harold Shipman presented as a trusted and respected general practitioner in the small English town of Hyde, Greater Manchester, where for decades he was regarded as a dedicated physician who made house calls, spent extra time with elderly patients, and showed genuine care for the community he served. Yet this beloved doctor was secretly murdering his patients on a scale that made him Britain's most prolific serial killer. Shipman graduated from Leeds School of Medicine in 1970 and began his medical career with apparent dedication to helping others, quickly establishing himself as a competent and caring doctor. He married his wife Primrose in 1966, and together they had 4 children, presenting to their community as a stable, respectable professional family. Shipman's first medical practice was in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, where he worked from 1974 to 1975, but he was forced to resign after practice partners discovered he had been forging prescriptions to obtain pethidine, a powerful opiate painkiller, for his own use. He was convicted of this offense in 1976, fined, and briefly attended a drug rehabilitation program, which should have ended his medical career but instead resulted in only a temporary setback. By 1977, Shipman had managed to return to medical practice, this time in Hyde, where he would eventually establish his own single-handed general practice in 1993 after years of working with a group practice. His patients and colleagues in Hyde knew him as a somewhat arrogant but highly competent doctor who was particularly attentive to elderly patients, especially elderly women who comprised the majority of his victims. Shipman's method of murder was insidious in its simplicity and in how it exploited the trust placed in doctors. He would visit patients at their homes, often elderly women living alone, and administer lethal doses of morphine, a pharmaceutical heroin, which would cause them to slip into unconsciousness and die relatively peacefully within minutes. After killing his victims, Shipman would create false medical records to indicate the person had been seriously ill, thus making their death appear natural and expected. Because he was a trusted doctor and because his victims were elderly, their deaths raised little initial suspicion, with families and authorities accepting Shipman's explanations that the deceased had been suffering from conditions that made death imminent. This ability to kill with medical authority and have those deaths accepted as natural allowed Shipman to murder for over 2 decades without serious investigation. The precise number of Shipman's victims may never be known with certainty, but the official inquiry concluded that he killed at least 215 patients between 1975 and 1998, with the true number possibly exceeding 250, making him one of history's most prolific serial killers. His victims ranged in age from 41 to 93, though the vast majority were elderly women over 75 who lived alone and trusted their doctor completely. Shipman's motive remains somewhat unclear even after extensive investigation and psychological analysis, though experts believe he was driven by a complex combination of factors including a God complex and desire for power over life and death, a possible addiction to the act of killing, financial motives in some cases where he attempted to profit from victims' estates, and perhaps a psychological connection to his mother's death from cancer when he was 17, during which time she received morphine injections that he witnessed providing relief. Unlike many serial killers, Shipman didn't appear to derive obvious sexual gratification from his crimes, and he showed little emotion when discussing his victims. The investigation that ultimately exposed Shipman began in March 1998 when Dr. Linda Reynolds, a general practitioner in a nearby practice, became concerned about the high death rate among Shipman's patients and the fact that many of them died at home with Shipman present. She reported her concerns to the local coroner, and while a preliminary police investigation was conducted, it failed to find sufficient evidence to proceed, partly because investigators didn't examine Shipman's patient records thoroughly, and partly because the idea that a trusted doctor could be systematically murdering patients seemed too extraordinary to believe. Just months later, in June 1998, Shipman made a critical mistake that would finally lead to his capture. He murdered Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde who was active and healthy despite her age. After her sudden death, her daughter Angela Woodruff, who was a solicitor, became suspicious when she learned that her mother had allegedly changed her will shortly before dying, leaving her entire £386,000 estate to Shipman. Woodruff knew this was completely out of character for her mother and that the will was likely forged, and she contacted the police. When Grundy's body was exhumed in August 1998, toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of morphine, and the investigation expanded rapidly as detectives realized they might be dealing with a serial killer. Police obtained a court order to examine Shipman's controlled drug records and patient files, discovering that he had been stealing large quantities of morphine from his practice and that he had routinely falsified patient records to make deaths appear expected when they had actually been sudden. As detectives dug deeper, they exhumed more bodies of former Shipman patients and found morphine in case after case. Shipman was arrested in September 1998 and initially denied all allegations, attempting to maintain his persona as a dedicated doctor who had been unfairly targeted. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, including the forged will, the toxicology results showing morphine in victim systems, the falsified medical records with timestamps showing they had been altered after deaths occurred, and testimony from relatives who described loved ones being healthy before Shipman's final visits. During his trial, which began in October 1999, prosecutors presented evidence regarding 15 murder charges, though investigators believe this was only a fraction of his actual victims. The prosecution demonstrated Shipman's pattern of visiting patients at home, administering lethal injections, falsifying records, and issuing death certificates that listed natural causes. Shipman maintained his innocence throughout, showing no remorse and claiming he was being persecuted. The jury deliberated for 6 days before convicting him on all 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, and Justice Forbes sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms with a recommendation that he never be released. A subsequent public inquiry examined Shipman's entire career and concluded that he had killed at least 215 patients and possibly 45 more, with most of these murders occurring after 1993 when he established his single-handed practice where he had no oversight from partners. The inquiry also examined how Shipman had been able to kill for so long without detection, identifying numerous failures in the systems meant to monitor doctors and protect patients, including inadequate regulation of controlled drugs, lack of meaningful oversight of death certificates, and a general culture of deference to medical authority that made people reluctant to question doctors. The Shipman case led to significant reforms in British medical practice, including stricter controls on controlled drugs, more thorough reviews of death certificates, mandatory revalidation for doctors, and enhanced monitoring of mortality rates among individual practitioners. On January 13, 2004, Harold Shipman was found hanged in his cell at Wakefield Prison, having taken his own life one day before his 58th birthday and before he could provide any meaningful explanation for why he had murdered so many trusting patients. His suicide meant that many questions would never be answered, and families of victims were denied the opportunity to fully understand why their loved ones had been killed. Primrose Shipman has consistently maintained her husband's innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, claiming he was wrongly convicted, a position that has alienated her from her children and the community. The Shipman case remains one of the most disturbing examples of a double life because it involved the ultimate betrayal of trust, a doctor who took an oath to preserve life systematically murdering those who trusted him most, using his medical knowledge and authority as tools for death rather than healing, all while maintaining the appearance of being a dedicated, caring physician who went above and beyond for his patients. Number 4. Russell Williams, high-ranking military officer. Colonel Russell Williams was the picture-perfect embodiment of military professionalism and success, a decorated officer in the Canadian Forces who rose to command CFB Trenton, Canada's largest and busiest Air Force base. Yet this respected commander who had flown Canadian Forces VIP aircraft carrying dignitaries including Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip was simultaneously committing a series of increasingly violent crimes that would shock the nation. Williams's military career was exemplary from the beginning, spanning 23 years of service during which he earned a reputation as an outstanding pilot, a meticulous planner, and a dedicated officer who seemed destined for continued advancement. He was married to Mary Elizabeth Harriman, a senior executive at the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, and the couple appeared to be a power couple in their respective fields, living in a home in Ottawa's upscale Westboro neighborhood, while also maintaining a cottage in the village of Tweed, Ontario. Williams was known among colleagues and subordinates as demanding but fair, a commander who held himself and others to the highest standards, someone who represented the best of Canadian military leadership. Neighbors in both locations where he lived knew him as polite, reserved, and unremarkable in his personal life, a quiet professional who kept his property maintained and caused no disturbances. Behind this impeccable facade, Williams was harboring increasingly dark compulsions that manifested first as fetish burglaries targeting women's homes where he would break in while residents were away and steal intimate items including underwear and lingerie, sometimes spending hours in the homes photographing himself wearing the stolen items, an escalation of behavior that had apparently been building for years. Between September 2007 and November 2009, Williams committed approximately 82 break-ins in the Tweed area and in Ottawa, targeting homes with a methodical approach that reflected his military training and attention to detail. He would carefully surveil potential targets, learning the routines of residents, choosing homes where he could enter undetected, and documenting his crimes with thousands of photographs that he stored on his computer. During these break-ins, Williams would typically steal underwear and other intimate items, and he would sometimes photograph himself wearing the items while standing in the victim's bedrooms, revealing a psychological profile that combined fetishism with a desire to violate women's privacy and personal spaces. These burglaries went largely unreported or were not connected because Williams operated across different jurisdictions and because victims often didn't realize items were missing or were too embarrassed to report thefts of intimate apparel. However, Williams's crimes escalated dramatically in late 2009 when breaking into homes and stealing items no longer satisfied his compulsions, and he moved to sexual assault and ultimately murder. On September 17, 2009, Williams broke into the home of a young woman in Tweed while she was sleeping and sexually assaulted her, binding her, photographing her, and threatening her before fleeing. This attack was reported to police, but without clear leads, the investigation stalled. Just over a month later, on November 24, 2009, Williams attacked another young woman in her home in Belleville, Ontario, this time even more violently, sexually assaulting her for hours while photographing and videotaping the attack. Then on January 28, 2010, Williams escalated to murder when he abducted 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd from her home in Belleville, taking her to his cottage in Tweed where he confined her for a full day, subjecting her to repeated sexual assaults that he photographed and videotaped before ultimately killing her and disposing of her body in a remote wooded area. Just weeks earlier, on November 25, 2009, Williams had also murdered 38-year-old Marie-France Comeau, a corporal in the Canadian Forces who was under his command at CFB Trenton. Williams broke into Comeau's home in Brighton, Ontario, while she was sleeping, bound and gagged her, sexually assaulted her while photographing the attack, and then killed her, leaving her body to be discovered by a friend. The murder of Comeau and the abduction of Lloyd triggered major investigations by the Ontario Provincial Police, who began connecting various crimes in the region and looking for patterns. The break in the case came when investigators established roadblocks near where Lloyd lived, checking vehicles and noting license plates of cars passing through the area around the time of her disappearance. Williams's vehicle was captured passing through the area, and when detectives looked into his background and found he had connections to Tweed, where Lloyd's abduction had occurred, and to CFB Trenton, where Comeau had been stationed, they identified him as a potential suspect. On February 7, 2010, just days after Lloyd's murder, Williams was called in for an interview with Detective Sergeant Jim Smith of the OPP's Behavioral Sciences Unit, and what followed was a masterclass in interrogation that has since been studied by law enforcement worldwide. The interview, which lasted about 10 hours, showed Smith methodically breaking down Williams's defenses, presenting evidence piece by piece, appealing to his military sense of honor and logic, and ultimately securing a full confession. Williams initially denied involvement, but as Smith presented evidence including tire tracks matching his vehicle and boot prints matching his boots at the crime scenes, Williams realized the evidence against him was insurmountable. In a moment that shocked investigators, Williams matter-of-factly confessed to both murders, both sexual assaults, and dozens of break-ins, showing no significant emotional response and discussing his crimes with the same detached professionalism he had brought to his military duties. He provided detailed information about where he had hidden Lloyd's body, which led to its recovery, and he cooperated in helping police locate evidence, including the massive collection of photographs he had taken documenting his crimes. Williams's arrest and the subsequent revelations devastated the Canadian military and shocked the nation, as people struggled to comprehend how someone in such a position of authority and trust could commit such heinous acts. His wife Mary Elizabeth Harriman was blindsided by the revelations, having apparently had no knowledge of her husband's criminal activities, and she filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. On October 21, 2010, Williams pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 82 counts of burglary, and he was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years on the murder charges, plus additional sentences for the other offenses. During his sentencing, Justice Robert Scott called Williams's crimes despicable and noted the profound betrayal of the military and the trust placed in him. The Canadian forces stripped Williams of his rank and removed his name from all military records and documents, implementing an administrative dismissal with disgrace. The first time in modern Canadian military history, this had been done to an officer of his rank. His uniforms, medals, and other military decorations were destroyed in a ceremony meant to symbolically erase his connection to the institution he had betrayed. Williams is currently incarcerated at Port Cartier Institution in Quebec, where he remains a model prisoner, reportedly maintaining the same discipline and routine that characterized his military career. The case prompted extensive analysis of how Williams could have maintained such a complete double life, with psychiatrists noting that he appeared to compartmentalize his criminal activities entirely from his professional life, showing no outward signs of the darkness within. Colleagues, friends, and subordinates reported being completely shocked, saying they had never noticed anything unusual about Williams's behavior or demeanor. The thousands of photographs Williams took documented his crimes in disturbing detail and revealed a methodical, organized personality that approached criminal activities with the same systematic planning he brought to military operations. Victims' families were further traumatized by learning that Williams had photographed and videotaped his attacks, creating lasting documentation of their loved ones' suffering. The Williams case remains one of the most shocking examples of a hidden double life in Canadian criminal history, demonstrating how someone can achieve the highest levels of professional success and public trust, while secretly engaging in progressively more violent criminal behavior, and raising troubling questions about whether there are any reliable indicators that might reveal such deception before it escalates to the most serious crimes. Number 5. Ariel Castro, the Cleveland Kidnapper. Ariel Castro lived for over a decade as a seemingly unremarkable Cleveland resident, working as a school bus driver, playing bass in local bands, and appearing to his Seymour Avenue neighbors as just another working-class guy living alone after a divorce. Yet inside his modest house at 2207 Seymour Avenue, he was holding 3 young women captive in conditions of unimaginable horror, having kidnapped them years apart and kept them imprisoned in a nightmare of abuse that would shock the world. When they finally escaped in May 2013, Castro was born in Puerto Rico in 1960 and moved to Cleveland as a child, growing up in the city's Latino community and eventually settling in the Tremont neighborhood where he would commit his crimes. He married Grimilda Figueroa in 1980, and they had 4 children together, but the marriage was marked by severe domestic violence, with Castro regularly beating his wife in incidents documented by police reports and later confirmed by his children. Figueroa eventually left Castro in 1996 after years of abuse, and their divorce was finalized in 2005. Despite his history of domestic violence, Castro was able to maintain employment as a school bus driver for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District from 2002 to 2012, a job that gave him access to children and positioned him as a seemingly trustworthy community member. He was also known in Cleveland's music scene as a bass player who performed with various Latin bands at local clubs and festivals, where people knew him as friendly and musical, never suspecting the horrors he was perpetrating at home. Castro's first victim was Michelle Knight, a 21-year-old woman who disappeared on August 23, 2002, after leaving a cousin's house in Cleveland. Castro encountered her and offered her a ride, which she accepted, but instead of taking her to her destination, he drove her to his house where he imprisoned her in an upstairs bedroom. Knight's disappearance received little media attention and minimal police investigation because she was an adult with a troubled background, including custody disputes over her son, and authorities assumed she had left voluntarily. Castro kept Knight captive, repeatedly raping and beating her, and she would remain his prisoner for over a decade, eventually joined by 2 other victims. On April 21, 2003, Castro abducted 16-year-old Amanda Berry as she was walking home from her job at a Burger King. Berry knew Castro because he was the father of a friend from school, and when he offered her a ride, she trusted him enough to accept, but he drove her to his house and imprisoned her alongside Knight in rooms equipped with chains, locks, and alarms that made escape impossible. Berry's disappearance sparked extensive searches and significant media coverage, as her family never gave up hope of finding her and held annual vigils on her birthday. Castro even attended one of these vigils while Berry was imprisoned in his home, a chilling demonstration of his ability to maintain a normal facade while actively perpetrating horrific crimes. On April 2, 2004, Castro abducted his 3rd victim, 14-year-old Gina De Jesus, who also knew Castro because he was the father of a school friend. De Jesus was walking home from school when Castro convinced her to get in his car by claiming his daughter was at his house and wanted to see her. Once inside the house, Castro imprisoned De Jesus with Knight and Berry, and she too became a victim of repeated sexual assault and abuse. De Jesus's disappearance created enormous media attention and community concern, with massive searches, vigils, and ongoing advocacy from her family who never stopped looking for her. For over 9 years, Castro held these 3 women prisoner in his house, keeping them confined to rooms upstairs where he had blocked windows, installed locks and chains, and created a soundproofed environment where their screams couldn't be heard by neighbors. He would rape them repeatedly, sometimes individually and sometimes together, and he subjected them to sadistic psychological torture, including making them watch news coverage of searches for them and forcing them to play Russian roulette. Castro impregnated Knight at least 5 times and beat her so severely that she miscarried each time, reportedly because he didn't want her to have a child. He also impregnated Berry, and on December 25, 2006, she gave birth to a daughter inside the house with only Knight's assistance, as Castro refused to get medical help. The child, who would later be given the name Jocelyn, grew up in captivity, known to Castro's family as his daughter from a relationship but never questioned closely enough for anyone to discover the truth. Throughout the years of captivity, Castro continued his seemingly normal life, going to work, playing music, shopping at local stores, and even having family members visit his house, though he never allowed anyone upstairs where the women were held. Neighbors occasionally heard screams or saw suspicious activity but either didn't report it or reported it without sufficient detail for police to investigate thoroughly, a failure that has been examined extensively in the aftermath of the case. Castro's ability to maintain his double life was aided by his controlling nature and manipulative personality, his careful planning in soundproofing and securing the prison areas of his house, and by a general lack of suspicion that anyone would commit such crimes in a middle-class neighborhood. The captivity finally ended on May 6, 2013, when Castro made a rare mistake by leaving the house without properly securing all of the locks on the front door. Berry, after years of looking for any opportunity to escape, heard Castro leave and realized the inner door was unlocked, though a storm door remained secured. She managed to push hard enough on the storm door to create a small opening and began screaming for help. A neighbor, Charles Ramsey, heard her cries and helped her push through the door far enough to get out, and Berry immediately asked to call 911. In a call that would become famous, Berry told the dispatcher, "Help me, I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped, and I've been missing for 10 years. And I'm here, I'm free now." Police arrived within minutes and entered Castro's house, where they found Knight and De Jesus still inside along with Berry's 6-year-old daughter. Castro was arrested later that evening after returning home from McDonald's where he had picked up food, apparently unaware that his victims had escaped and police were waiting for him. The case immediately became international news, as people struggled to comprehend how 3 women had been held captive for approximately a decade in a residential neighborhood without being discovered. The investigation revealed that Castro had been extraordinarily methodical in planning and maintaining his crimes, using chains, locks, and alarm systems to secure his victims, keeping careful schedules to minimize the risk of detection, and psychologically manipulating the women to make them believe escape was impossible. He kept detailed notes and records, including a letter found in the house in which he claimed to be a sex addict and sought to explain or justify his actions, though he also blamed his victims for getting in his car. Castro was charged with 977 counts, including kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder for the pregnancies he had terminated through abuse. The aggravated murder charges were particularly significant because Ohio law recognizes forced miscarriage as murder. On July 26, 2013, Castro pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for prosecutors not seeking the death penalty, and he was sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing, Castro bizarrely claimed that his crimes weren't as bad as people thought, and that there was harmony in the house, statements that outraged victims and observers. Knight, Berry, and De Jesus each made victim impact statements, with Knight delivering a particularly powerful speech in which she directly addressed Castro and told him she would not let him destroy her life. Castro served only 1 month of his sentence before being found hanged in his cell at the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio, on September 3, 2013, in an apparent suicide, though his family disputed this conclusion. His death meant that many questions about his motivations and the full extent of his crimes would never be fully answered. Following Castro's death, the house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was demolished in August 2013 in a highly publicized event meant to provide closure for victims and the community, with Michelle Knight activating the demolition equipment. The 3 survivors have since rebuilt their lives with varying degrees of public visibility. Amanda Berry has advocated for missing persons causes and co-authored a book about her experience. Gina De Jesus has also written about her experience and works with organizations helping missing persons and their families. Michelle Knight, now known as Lily Rose Lee, has been the most public of the 3, writing books, speaking about her experience, and advocating for victims of abuse and trafficking. The Castro case exposed significant failures in Cleveland's handling of missing persons reports and responses to suspicious activities, leading to reforms in how such cases are investigated. It also served as a stark reminder that even in ordinary neighborhoods, extraordinary horrors can be hidden behind the facades of seemingly normal houses and lives, and that evil can persist for years when a perpetrator is sufficiently calculating and when opportunities for detection are missed or ignored. Number 6. Joseph Duncan, the registered sex offender next door. Joseph Edward Duncan III managed to hide in plain sight as a registered sex offender who should have been closely monitored but instead was able to commit one of the most horrific family murder kidnapping cases in American history, demonstrating catastrophic failures in sex offender registration and monitoring systems. Duncan's criminal history began in his youth when he was arrested at age 16 for sexually assaulting a young boy at gunpoint in Washington state, a crime that should have marked him as an extreme danger to children and resulted in life in prison. But instead he received only a 20-year sentence and was paroled after serving 14 years. Throughout his time in prison and after his release, Duncan received multiple psychological evaluations that consistently identified him as having an extremely high risk of reoffending and as a violent sexual predator with compulsions toward children that he could not control. Yet he was released nonetheless and placed on sex offender registries that proved wholly inadequate to prevent his continued crimes. After his release, Duncan lived in various locations in the Pacific Northwest, registered as a sex offender as required but otherwise lived relatively freely, working various jobs, maintaining a blog where he documented his twisted thoughts and struggles with his compulsions, and presenting to those around him as a somewhat odd but harmless man dealing with past mistakes. His blog, titled The Fifth Nail and Other Writings Found Later, revealed that Duncan was well aware of his dangerously violent sexual desires toward children, and that he experienced constant internal struggle between these desires and knowing they were wrong, but ultimately his desires won out repeatedly. In 2005, Duncan was facing trial in Minnesota for molesting a young boy, but rather than appear in court, he fled and traveled to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where he began stalking families with children, looking for victims to kidnap. Duncan spent weeks conducting surveillance on multiple families, carefully choosing targets and planning his attack with a methodical approach that reflected both his predatory nature and his experience evading capture. He selected the home of Brenda Gruen, a 40-year-old single mother living with her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, 37, her 13-year-old son Slade, and her 2 younger children, 9-year-old Dylan and 8-year-old Shasta. On the night of May 15, 2005, Duncan broke into the family's rural home, armed with a shotgun and other weapons, and in a crime of staggering brutality, he bludgeoned and murdered Brenda, Mark, and Slade, binding the two younger children and taking them into the Montana wilderness where he held them captive at a remote campsite. For weeks, Duncan kept Dylan and Shasta prisoner in the mountains, subjecting them to horrific sexual abuse that he videotaped, treating them with a bizarre combination of violence and attempts at friendliness that demonstrated his profoundly disturbed psychology. Duncan apparently believed he had found a remote enough location where he could keep the children indefinitely, and he documented his assaults on video, creating evidence that would later be used against him but that also traumatized all who had to view it during the investigation and trial. This nightmare continued for over 6 weeks until July 2, 2005, when Duncan made a catastrophic error by taking Shasta to a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, apparently feeling confident enough in his control over her to risk bringing her into public. A waitress at the restaurant recognized Shasta from the massive media coverage of her disappearance and the murders of her family, and she immediately notified authorities. Police arrived and arrested Duncan at the restaurant, recovering Shasta, who was severely traumatized but alive. Duncan initially tried to claim that Shasta had come with him willingly and that he had rescued her, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, and he eventually confessed to the murders and kidnappings. Tragically, Dylan Gruen was not with them at the restaurant, and Duncan revealed that he had murdered the 9-year-old boy days earlier and disposed of his body in Montana, a final act of cruelty that shattered any remaining hope for Dylan's survival. Duncan's trial and subsequent legal proceedings revealed a staggering pattern of violence and depravity extending back decades. In addition to the Idaho crimes, he was eventually linked to the 1996 murders of two half-sisters, 10-year-old Samieja White and 11-year-old Carmen Cubayas, in Seattle, Washington, and to the 1997 murder of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in California, cases that had gone unsolved for years but that Duncan confessed to when faced with overwhelming evidence. These confessions revealed that Duncan had been an active serial killer of children for at least a decade, operating across multiple states while ostensibly being monitored as a registered sex offender, an appalling failure of the systems meant to protect children from predators like him. The evidence against Duncan included his own videotaped recordings of his assaults on Dylan and Shasta, his confessions to investigators, forensic evidence from the Gruen home and the campsite where he had held the children, and witness testimony from those who had encountered him during his time on the run. During his federal trial for kidnapping and other charges related to the Gruen case, Duncan represented himself at times and made bizarre, rambling statements attempting to explain or justify his actions, claiming he was addicted to harming children and describing his compulsions as irresistible. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death in federal court, and he was also convicted in state court in Idaho and sentenced to death there as well, making him one of the few inmates under both federal and state death sentences. Duncan was also convicted for the murders of Samieja White and Carmen Cubayas and sentenced to life imprisonment for those crimes. Throughout his incarceration, Duncan continued to write and attempt to communicate with the outside world, sometimes claiming remorse and other times seeming to take satisfaction in his crimes, presenting a disturbing portrait of a man who understood that his desires were evil but felt powerless or unwilling to control them. Shasta Gruen, the sole survivor of the attack on her family, has shown remarkable resilience, though she has understandably struggled with the trauma of her experience and has faced ongoing challenges including legal troubles in adulthood that some experts believe are related to her childhood victimization. She has rarely spoken publicly about her ordeal, but when she has demonstrated strength and a determination to not let Duncan's evil define her entire life. On March 28, 2021, Joseph Duncan died in prison at age 58 from brain cancer, dying before his death sentences could be carried out, which frustrated some victims' families who felt he escaped full justice. His death did spare Shasta Gruen and others from having to potentially testify or relive trauma during appeals processes that could have continued for decades. The Duncan case exposed critical failures in sex offender registration and monitoring systems, demonstrating that simply requiring offenders to register is insufficient if there is no meaningful tracking of their movements or intervention when they violate terms of their release. Duncan had been evaluated as extremely high risk, had violated probation and parole multiple times, and had even fled from pending charges. Yet he was able to travel freely and commit additional horrendous crimes. The case prompted some reforms to sex offender monitoring, though advocates argue that much more needs to be done to prevent similar tragedies. The Duncan case also illustrated how sex offenders with extensive criminal histories can sometimes present themselves as reformed or struggling with addiction-like compulsions, generating sympathy that proves tragically misplaced when they inevitably reoffend. Duncan's writings and statements reveal a man who was keenly aware that his desires were wrong and harmful, who sometimes claimed to want to change, but who ultimately chose to continue acting on his compulsions rather than taking the only action that might have prevented further harm, remaining incarcerated or, as some argued, accepting that he was too dangerous to ever be free. The families destroyed by Duncan's crimes, the Grunes, the Whites, the Cubiases, and the Martinezes, represent just the known victims of a predator who operated for decades while systems meant to protect children failed catastrophically, allowing him to maintain enough freedom to continue his horrific double life as a registered sex offender who appeared to be complying with monitoring requirements while actively stalking, kidnapping, abusing, and murdering children. Number 7. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary Leon Ridgway appeared to his community in the Seattle-Tacoma area of Washington as an unremarkable working-class man employed for over 3 decades at the Kenworth Truck Factory. A religious Christian who frequently read the Bible and talked about his faith. A married father who seemed stable if a bit socially awkward. Yet this seemingly simple, harmless man was the Green River Killer, one of America's most prolific serial killers who murdered at least 49 women and girls and possibly as many as 90 over a 20-year period while successfully evading capture despite being interviewed by police multiple times. Ridgway was born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, and grew up in a troubled household where his mother was reportedly domineering and his relationship with women was complicated from an early age. He struggled in school and had a documented low IQ, yet he was clever enough to avoid detection for his crimes for 2 decades, demonstrating that traditional measures of intelligence don't always correlate with criminal sophistication. Ridgway married 3 times, with his first 2 marriages ending in divorce and his third marriage to Judith Mawson lasting from 1988 until his arrest in 2001, with Mawson later stating she had no knowledge of his crimes and was completely shocked by his arrest. Throughout his adult life, Ridgway maintained steady employment at Kenworth, where coworkers knew him as a reliable if unremarkable worker who kept to himself and followed routines meticulously, never suspecting that he spent his off hours hunting for victims along the Pacific Highway South Strip in King County, Washington. Ridgway's victims were primarily women and girls involved in prostitution or with troubled backgrounds that made them vulnerable, a population he specifically targeted because he believed they would not be missed or that their disappearances would not be investigated as thoroughly as those of other citizens, a calculation that proved partially correct as many of his victims' disappearances initially received minimal attention. Beginning in 1982 and continuing into the late 1990s, Ridgway picked up women and girls, took them to secluded locations, murdered them by strangulation, and disposed of their bodies in the Green River and in wooded areas throughout King County, often returning to the dump sites to have sex with the corpses, a necrophilic pattern that demonstrated the profound psychological disturbance underlying his crimes. The name Green River Killer came from the discovery of the first 5 victims in or near the Green River in the summer of 1982, which sparked one of the largest serial killer investigations in American history. As the body count grew and the pattern of missing women along the highway became apparent, a Green River task force was formed, eventually involving dozens of detectives and costing millions of dollars, yet Ridgway continued killing for years despite being on their radar as a potential suspect relatively early in the investigation. Ridgway was interviewed by police as early as 1983 and again in 1984, and his truck had been spotted in areas where victims had last been seen, but investigators lacked sufficient evidence to arrest him. In 1984, Ridgway actually passed a polygraph test related to the murders, which, combined with his unremarkable demeanor and the weak forensic technology of the era, allowed him to slip through the investigative net. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Ridgway continued killing while living what appeared to be a normal life, going to work, attending church services where he was known as devout, maintaining his home, and interacting with neighbors and family who saw no signs of his dark compulsions. Ridgway later explained in confessions that he killed women because of complicated feelings combining sexual desire with rage toward women, particularly those involved in prostitution, whom he both sought out for sex and despised. He described picking up victims, sometimes engaging with them sexually before killing them, strangling them with his hands or with ligatures, and then disposing of their bodies with meticulous care to avoid detection. He would often weigh bodies down with rocks, pose them in degrading positions, or scatter remains across multiple locations to confuse investigators, demonstrating planning and forethought that contradicted his low IQ but revealed a cunning specific to avoiding capture for his crimes. The break in the case came in 2001 when advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to link Ridgway to 4 of the Green River victims through microscopic samples of paint from the Kenworth factory found on victims and through semen evidence that earlier technology had been unable to analyze conclusively. On November 30, 2001, police arrested Ridgway at his workplace, and under interrogation, he initially denied involvement but eventually began confessing when faced with the DNA evidence. What followed was an extraordinary series of interviews in which Ridgway confessed to killing 48 women and provided detailed information about each murder, leading investigators to previously undiscovered remains and helping solve decades-old missing persons cases. Ridgway's confessions were chilling in their matter-of-fact tone, and in the details he remembered about victims, locations, and methods, demonstrating that despite his low IQ, he had retained extraordinary recall of his crimes. He explained that he had continued killing throughout the years, with most murders occurring in the 1980s and early 1990s, but with some possibly continuing even after he became a suspect. Ridgway's motivation appeared to combine sexual compulsion with a desire to control and eliminate women he viewed as disposable, and his ability to compartmentalize his crimes from his daily life was remarkable. He would murder someone and then go home to his wife, attend church the next day, and report to work Monday morning without any apparent difficulty maintaining these contradictory existences. In 2003, King County prosecutors reached an agreement with Ridgway in which he would plead guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. A controversial decision that spared him execution but ensured he would provide information to help solve cases and bring closure to families. An additional charge was added in 2011 when DNA linked him to a 49th victim, Rebecca Marrero. During his sentencing hearings, families of victims confronted Ridgway, with some expressing forgiveness while others detailed the decades of pain his crimes had caused. Ridgway showed little emotion throughout, occasionally offering what seemed like hollow apologies but generally appearing detached from the enormity of his crimes. He was sentenced to 48 life sentences without possibility of parole plus 480 years for tampering with evidence and 1 life sentence for the 49th murder, ensuring he would die in prison. Ridgway is currently incarcerated at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he remains in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and the danger other inmates pose to serial killers, particularly those whose victims include young women. The Green River Killer case became one of the most studied in criminal psychology and law enforcement training because it demonstrates how a serial killer can hide in plain sight, maintain employment and family relationships, appear religious and morally upright, and still commit horrific crimes over decades. Ridgway's low intelligence combined with his high cunning for the specific tasks of selecting vulnerable victims and avoiding detection challenged assumptions about serial killer profiles. The case also highlighted society's failures to protect vulnerable populations, as Ridgway specifically targeted women involved in prostitution or with troubled backgrounds, calculating correctly that their disappearances would receive less attention and resources than victims from other demographics. The families of Ridgway's victims have struggled with the fact that he avoided the death penalty, though many found some closure in his confessions and in the recovery of remains that allowed them to properly bury their loved ones. The investigation's eventual success demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence even when technology cannot immediately analyze it, as the paint and DNA samples that eventually led to Ridgway's conviction had been collected years before the technology existed to make definitive matches. Ridgway's third wife, Judith Mawson, wrote a book about her experience being married to a serial killer without knowing it, describing how Ridgway maintained an entirely separate existence from their domestic life, how she saw no signs of his crimes despite living with him for over a decade, and how she struggled to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the monster revealed by his confessions. The Green River Killer case remains a definitive example of how evil can wear a mask of mundane normalcy, how someone can commit the most terrible acts while maintaining a functional life that appears entirely ordinary to everyone around them, and how the investigation and prevention of serial crimes requires resources, persistence, and technological tools that may take decades to fully develop. Number 8. Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Rodney Alcala managed to hide his identity as a prolific serial killer and rapist while maintaining various public personas including that of a successful photographer, a contestant on the popular television show The Dating Game, and a UCLA graduate with apparent charm and intelligence. Yet this handsome, educated man with a winning smile was hunting victims across the country, murdering at least 8 people and likely many more while evading justice through a combination of luck, legal technicalities, and a mobility that allowed him to operate across multiple jurisdictions. Alcala was born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Bucher in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas, and his early life was marked by instability and troubling behavior that escalated over time. He served in the Army from 1961 to 1964 but received a medical discharge after a nervous breakdown, an early indication of psychological problems that would manifest in increasingly violent ways. In 1968, Alcala was just beginning what would become a decades-long career of violence when a witness saw him lure 8-year-old Tali Shapiro into his Hollywood apartment. Police arrived to find Shapiro brutally beaten and sexually assaulted, but Alcala fled before he could be arrested. Despite making the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, Alcala escaped to New York where he enrolled at NYU under an assumed name and actually completed a film degree while wanted for his attack on Shapiro, demonstrating remarkable audacity and confidence in his ability to evade capture. He was eventually caught in 1971 after someone who knew him from California recognized him at a New Hampshire summer camp where he was working with children under the name John Berger, a circumstance that horrified investigators when they realized a wanted child molester had been given access to children for months. Alcala pleaded guilty to child molestation in the Shapiro case and served just 34 months in prison before being paroled in 1974. An astonishingly lenient outcome given the severity of his attack. Just months after his release, Alcala was arrested again for assaulting a 13-year-old girl but was released after the girl's family declined to have her testify, a decision that would have tragic consequences. By the mid-1970s, Alcala had relocated to California where he presented himself as a professional photographer, using this as a cover to approach potential victims, particularly young women and girls whom he would convince to pose for photographs before attacking them. This photography ruse was remarkably effective, allowing Alcala to approach women in public places like beaches and campuses, appearing professional and artistic rather than predatory. In 1978, Alcala achieved a bizarre moment of fame when he appeared as a contestant on The Dating Game, a popular television show where bachelors competed for a date with a single woman. Alcala was introduced as a successful photographer who enjoyed skydiving and motorcycling, and he won the competition with his charming answers and confident demeanor, beating 2 other bachelors to win a date with Cheryl Bradshaw. However, Bradshaw later refused to go on the date with Alcala, telling producers that she found him creepy despite his television charm, an intuition that may have saved her life. What makes this television appearance particularly chilling is that Alcala was in the middle of his murder spree when he filmed the show, having already killed at least 2 people and with more murders to come. The contrast between Alcala smiling and joking on national television and the reality of his violent crimes represents one of the most disturbing examples of a killer hiding in plain sight. Between 1977 and 1979, Alcala murdered at least 5 women and girls in California, including 18-year-old Jill Barkham, 27-year-old Georgia Wixted, 32-year-old Charlotte Lamb, 21-year-old Jill Parento, and 12-year-old Robin Samso, though investigators believe his actual victim count may be much higher. His pattern was to approach women, often using his camera as a prop to gain trust, then attack them in isolated locations where he would rape and murder them, often posing their bodies in degrading positions and photographing them post-mortem. Alcala's downfall came with the murder of Robin Samso in June 1979. Multiple witnesses saw Alcala approaching Robin and her friend at Huntington Beach, offering to photograph them, and when Robin disappeared shortly after, one of those witnesses was able to provide a description that led to a sketch. A woman recognized the sketch as matching Rodney Alcala, and when police obtained a search warrant for his storage locker, they found a trove of evidence including Robin's earrings and hundreds of photographs of women and girls in various poses, some appearing drugged or unconscious. This photograph collection would become central to the investigation, as detectives realized many of the subjects could be additional victims. Alcala was arrested, tried, and convicted of Robin Samso's murder in 1980, but his case would wind through the courts for decades due to repeated appeals and retrials. His first conviction was overturned on appeal in 1984, his second conviction was overturned in 2001, and he wasn't definitively convicted until 2010, 31 years after the crime, when DNA evidence linked him conclusively not only to Samso's murder but also to the murders of the 4 other California victims. During his various trials, Alcala represented himself at times, bizarrely questioning himself on the witness stand in different voices and presenting a defense that struck observers as both intelligent and deeply disturbed. The 2010 trial included DNA evidence that hadn't been available in earlier trials and also featured testimony about additional murders in New York, as investigators working the California case discovered that Alcala had been in New York during the times of 2 unsolved murders there. In 2012, Alcala was extradited to New York where he pleaded guilty to the 1971 murder of Cornelia Crilly and the 1977 murder of Ellen Hover, bringing his officially confirmed victim count to 7, with an 8th victim, Christine Thornton, confirmed through DNA in 2016 after her family recognized her in one of Alcala's photographs. Throughout these proceedings, law enforcement released hundreds of photographs found in Alcala's possession, hoping that families might recognize missing loved ones. And while some individuals were identified and found to be alive, many remain unidentified, leading to speculation that Alcala's true victim count could be dozens or even more than 100. Alcala was sentenced to death in California for the 5 murders there, and he received additional 25 years to life sentences for the New York murders, though he would never face execution as California has a de facto moratorium on capital punishment. During his time on death row at San Quentin State Prison, Alcala filed numerous appeals and continued attempting to manipulate the legal system, demonstrating the same intelligence and cunning that had allowed him to evade justice for so long. On July 24, 2021, Rodney Alcala died of natural causes at age 77 while awaiting execution, dying before victims' families could see justice fully served through his execution. The Alcala case is particularly disturbing because it demonstrates how someone can be repeatedly identified as dangerous, convicted of violent crimes, yet still be released to commit additional horrific acts, revealing failures in the criminal justice system of the 1970s that allowed violent offenders to receive inappropriately lenient sentences and insufficient monitoring after release. Alcala's appearance on The Dating Game has become iconic in true crime culture, representing the ultimate example of a killer hiding behind charm and normalcy, smiling for cameras while actively hunting victims. The photographs found in his possession remain a haunting aspect of the case, as many of the women and girls pictured have never been identified, leaving open the terrible possibility that there are additional victims and families who still don't know what happened to their missing loved ones. Alcala's intelligence, education, and apparent sophistication contradicted simplistic stereotypes about what a serial killer looks like, demonstrating that predators can be articulate, educated, even artistic, using these qualities not as alternatives to violence but as tools to facilitate it. The case has been featured in numerous documentaries and true crime programs, with The Dating Game footage serving as a chilling reminder that evil can wear many faces and that the most dangerous predators are often those who are best at appearing normal, trustworthy, and even desirable. Number 9. Robert Hansen, the Butcher Baker. Robert Hansen lived in Anchorage, Alaska, as a successful baker who owned his own shop, a married father of 2 children, a respected member of the community known for his skills as a baker and his passion for hunting. Yet this mild-mannered businessman with a stutter and a socially awkward demeanor was abducting women, flying them to remote wilderness locations in his private plane, releasing them and hunting them like animals before murdering them. A horrifying pattern that continued for over a decade. Hansen was born in 1939 in Iowa, where he grew up as a shy, awkward young man with severe acne and a stutter that made him a target for bullying and left him with deep resentment, particularly toward women who rejected him. He joined the Army Reserve, married, and worked various jobs before eventually moving to Alaska in the early 1970s, drawn by the state's hunting opportunities and the chance for a fresh start. In Anchorage, Hansen opened a bakery called Hansen's Bakery that became successful and well-regarded in the community, and he cultivated a reputation as an accomplished hunter and outdoorsman, winning several competitions and appearing to be living the Alaskan dream. His wife Darla and their children saw him as a devoted family man who worked hard at the bakery and spent his free time pursuing his hunting hobby, never suspecting that this hobby had taken a dark turn. Beginning in the early 1970s and continuing until 1983, Hansen abducted at least 17 women and likely more, targeting primarily prostitutes and dancers whom he believed would not be missed or whose disappearances would not be taken seriously by police. His method was to kidnap women at gunpoint from downtown Anchorage, take them to his home or to a remote cabin he maintained, rape them, and then transport them via his private plane to isolated wilderness areas in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley and Nick River region. Once in these remote locations, Hansen would release the women and give them a head start before hunting them with hunting rifles and knives, treating human beings as prey in a grotesque perversion of the hunting skills he was known for in the community. After killing his victims, Hansen would often bury them in shallow graves, or leave them exposed in the wilderness, where bears and other scavengers would further conceal the evidence of his crimes. For over a decade, Hansen's hunting trips aroused no suspicion because they fit perfectly with his known hobby, and because Alaska's vast wilderness made it easy for bodies to remain undiscovered indefinitely. Hansen's double life was enabled by several factors, including his choice of victims from marginalized populations, his access to remote wilderness through his pilot skills and plane ownership, his respected position in the community that made suspicion seem unlikely, and the general difficulty of law enforcement coverage in Alaska's expansive geography. Police did investigate some missing women reports and found some bodies in the wilderness, but without connecting evidence, they treated these as separate incidents rather than the work of a serial killer. The case began to break in June 1983 when 17-year-old Cindy Paulson escaped from Hansen after he had kidnapped and raped her, but before he could transport her to the wilderness. Paulson managed to escape while Hansen was loading his plane, and she flagged down a truck driver who took her to police. Despite being traumatized, Paulson provided detailed information about Hansen, including his description, the location of his house, and the fact that he owned a plane, giving investigators crucial leads. However, when police interviewed Hansen, he denied everything, and because of his respected position in the community and clean public image, investigators initially weren't sure whether to believe Paulson's account or Hansen's denials. The investigation might have stalled if not for persistence by Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Glenn Flotha and other investigators who continued building a case against Hansen even as he maintained his innocence and his daily routine at the bakery. Police obtained search warrants for Hansen's home and vehicles, where they found a hidden weapons cache including rifles that ballistics testing would later link to some of the murders. They also found aviation maps with locations marked in a manner that corresponded to where bodies had been found or would later be discovered, providing powerful circumstantial evidence of Hansen's guilt. As the evidence mounted, Hansen's denials became less credible, and in February 1984, facing overwhelming evidence, he confessed to killing 17 women, though he claimed not to remember exact details about many of the murders. Hansen provided investigators with locations of bodies, some of which had already been found and others that were discovered based on his information, confirming his confessions and allowing families to recover remains. In his confessions, Hansen described his crimes in chilling detail, explaining how he selected victims, how he transported them to the wilderness, and how he hunted them, all delivered in a matter-of-fact tone that revealed his complete lack of empathy for the women he had killed. Psychologists who evaluated Hansen determined that his crimes were driven by a combination of factors including profound resentment toward women stemming from rejection and bullying in his youth, a need for power and control that he couldn't achieve in normal social interactions, and a conflation of his hunting hobby with violent sexual fantasies that escalated into actual hunting of human prey. The evaluation also noted Hansen's ability to compartmentalize his crimes from his daily life, returning from hunting trips where he had murdered someone to open his bakery and interact normally with customers, family, and community members. In 1984, Hansen pleaded guilty to 4 of the murders in a plea deal that spared him the death penalty in exchange for providing information about all of his crimes. He was sentenced to 461 years plus life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never be released. Hansen was initially incarcerated in Alaska but was later transferred to prisons in other states as Alaska's prison system lacked long-term maximum security facilities. Throughout his imprisonment, Hansen gave occasional interviews in which he discussed his crimes, sometimes showing what appeared to be remorse and other times seeming to take pride in his ability to evade detection for so long. He maintained that he had killed only 17 women despite speculation by investigators that the true number might be higher, as Alaska's wilderness could easily conceal additional bodies that were never found. Robert Hansen died in August 2014 at age 75, while incarcerated at Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage, where he had been transferred from his prison in Seward for medical treatment. His death came without any significant additional revelations about potential additional victims, leaving some questions permanently unanswered. The Hansen case had profound impacts on Alaska law enforcement and on how missing persons cases involving sex workers and marginalized women are investigated, as it demonstrated that predators specifically target these populations, assuming police won't prioritize finding them. The case also revealed how hunters' access to wilderness and aviation skills could be perverted into tools for serial murder, a unique aspect of Hansen's crimes that reflected Alaska's particular geography and culture. Hansen's bakery was sold and eventually closed, and his family has lived under the shadow of his crimes, with his wife Darla maintaining she had no knowledge of his murderous activities despite living with him throughout the years he was killing. The contrast between Hansen the baker and family man and Hansen the hunter of human prey represents one of the most stark examples of a double life in criminal history, demonstrating that even in a community where Hansen was known and respected, evil was hiding behind a facade of normalcy so complete that even a violent escape by a victim wasn't initially enough to overcome the perception that this successful small business owner couldn't possibly be a serial killer. Number 10. Ariel Keyes, the methodical ghost. Ariel Keyes represents perhaps the most chilling example of a double life in modern true crime because, unlike most serial killers who have some connection to their victims or operate in familiar areas, Keyes was a completely nomadic killer who planned murders years in advance, buried kill kits containing weapons and materials in various locations across the country, and traveled thousands of miles to commit random murders of strangers, all while maintaining a seemingly stable life in Anchorage, Alaska, as a construction business owner, devoted father, and unremarkable community member whom neighbors described as polite and helpful. Keyes was born in 1978 in Utah and grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household that moved frequently, living for periods in Washington state and Maine, with Keyes receiving minimal formal education as his family practiced homeschooling and lived in relative isolation. He joined the Army in 1998 and served until 2001, receiving an honorable discharge, and it was likely during this period that he developed the discipline and planning skills that would characterize his later crimes. After his discharge, Keyes moved to Alaska where he established a construction business called Keyes Construction that was successful enough to support him and his daughter from a previous relationship, and he appeared to live an ordinary life, maintaining friendships, participating in social activities, and giving no indication to those around him that he was a serial killer operating across North America. What made Keyes uniquely dangerous was his methodology, which involved extraordinary advanced planning and a commitment to randomness designed to make his crimes essentially unsolvable. Beginning in the late 1990s or early 2000s and continuing until his capture in 2012, Keyes traveled around the United States, identifying locations far from his home where he would bury kill kits containing weapons, tools, and materials he might need to commit a murder. These caches were buried near remote areas, often near hiking trails or wilderness locations, and Keyes maintained detailed records of their locations. When he decided to kill, which he later said was driven by a compulsion he couldn't fully explain, he would travel thousands of miles from Alaska to locations where he had previously buried supplies, select a random victim with no connection to himself, commit the murder using materials from his cache that couldn't be traced to him, and then return to Alaska and his normal life. This method meant that his crimes occurred in different states with no apparent connection between victims, no forensic evidence linking back to him, and no reason for investigators in different jurisdictions to suspect they were dealing with the same killer. Keyes's victims were selected essentially at random, chosen based on opportunity rather than any particular characteristics, which made identifying patterns almost impossible for law enforcement. He later told investigators that he had killed people across the country and that some of his victims had never been found, claiming a victim count that investigators have struggled to verify but that could be as high as 11 or more. Keyes was extremely security conscious, avoiding surveillance cameras when possible, using cash for transactions during his crime trips, disposing of evidence carefully, and maintaining strict operational security that prevented anyone in his personal life from knowing about his criminal activities. His downfall came in February 2012 when he deviated from his usual methodology and killed 18-year-old Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, close to his home, in a crime that would ultimately expose his entire operation. Keyes abducted Koenig from the coffee shop where she worked, demanding ransom from her family even though he had already killed her, and he attempted to make it appear that she was still alive by posing her body and photographing it. Keys's demand for ransom was uncharacteristic and demonstrated either desperation or a breakdown in his usually meticulous planning, and the use of Koenig's debit card in various locations created a digital trail that investigators could follow. The FBI began tracking the card usage, and in March 2012, they arrested Keys in Texas where he had traveled with his girlfriend in what appeared to be an attempt to flee. Once in custody, Keys initially denied involvement in Koenig's disappearance, but as FBI investigators presented evidence and began uncovering his travel patterns and the kill kits he had buried, he realized the extent to which they had penetrated his operational security. Keys agreed to confess to some of his crimes in exchange for certain conditions, including that his daughter would never know about his murders and that he would receive the death penalty rather than life imprisonment. Over several months of interviews, Keys provided information about multiple murders, including a couple in Vermont, Bill and Lorraine Currier, whom he had killed in June 2011 in a home invasion that had been unsolved, and he hinted at additional victims without providing specific details. The interviews revealed Keys's chilling methodology and his apparent lack of emotional connection to his crimes, discussing his victims and methods with a matter-of-fact tone that disturbed even experienced FBI agents. He explained that he viewed his crimes as puzzles to be solved, challenges in avoiding detection, and that he derived satisfaction from the planning and execution rather than from any particular sadistic enjoyment of violence itself, though his actions certainly caused tremendous suffering. On December 2, 2012, before his trial could proceed and before investigators could extract full information about all of his crimes, Ariel Keys was found dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex, having committed suicide by cutting his wrists and strangling himself with bedding material. His death frustrated investigators who believed he had information about additional unsolved murders and disappearances, and it left families of potential victims without answers. The investigation into Keys's crimes has continued even after his death, with the FBI conducting extensive reviews of his travel records, financial transactions, and communications, trying to connect him to unsolved cases across the country. Investigators have confirmed at least 3 murders: Samantha Koenig, Bill Currier, and Lorraine Currier, but believe the true number is significantly higher based on Keys's statements and on the evidence of his extensive travel and the multiple kill kits he had buried. The Keys case has fundamentally changed how law enforcement thinks about serial killers, as he represents a new type of offender who uses modern mobility and careful planning to commit geographically dispersed crimes with no apparent connection, making traditional investigative approaches that rely on identifying patterns and connections between victims largely ineffective. Keys's ability to maintain a completely normal life in Alaska while periodically traveling to commit murders demonstrates an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization and deception. Friends, family, and business associates described being completely shocked by his arrest, noting that he seemed like a regular guy who worked hard, cared for his daughter, and had normal social interactions with no indications of the darkness within. His girlfriend, who was with him when he was arrested in Texas, maintained she had no knowledge of his crimes. The FBI has noted that Keys may represent a more common phenomenon than previously believed: highly mobile, carefully planned serial killings that go undetected because they don't fit established patterns. The case has prompted enhanced cooperation between law enforcement agencies and more sophisticated analysis of seemingly unconnected crimes that might actually be the work of offenders like Keys, who specifically design their methods to avoid creating detectable patterns. For families of Keys's confirmed and potential victims, his suicide was devastating, robbing them of the opportunity to see him face trial and to potentially learn what happened to their loved ones. The Keys case stands as a reminder that evil can be extraordinarily patient and methodical, that some of the most dangerous individuals are those who are best at controlling their impulses and planning their actions, and that the double life Keys maintained wasn't the result of impulsive decisions or obvious red flags, but rather of calculated choices over years to separate completely his criminal activities from his public persona in a way that nearly allowed him to commit the perfect series of crimes that would never be connected or solved. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.